Warhammer has a lot of strange models in its day. It's been around for almost 40 years at this point, so it's no surprise that it's been through many ups and downs in terms of modeling, and we're going to cover some of the strangest from all times, really. At number 10, we have these squigs, who you may think are for the orcs, but in actuality, the squigs got their origin as a Tyranid unit, sort of filling in the same role that Ripper Swarms would fulfill these days. They were sort of the messed up or so degraded species that lived in the Tyranid Empire, as it was at the time, that they've just kind of turned into these weird monster things. These models, I think, are completely fine, and the reason they're at number 10 is just because I wanted to highlight the strange shift that squigs went from being a Tyranid unit to an orc unit in just a few years. This was released in 1992, at the tail end of Rogue Trader and the very beginning of 2nd edition. Overall, there's nothing too strange about these, but I do really like that spider model in the back right. You can tell here, the squigs are all very varied, which is something that has stayed true for squigs forever. There's just an insane variety of them. Pretty much anything you want to do, you can probably do it with a squig. Moving on to number 9, we have an Eldar Farseer from a similar era. The reason I put this guy here is just I think his helmet looks very unusual for the Eldar. Released in 1991, this is of course a Rogue Trader era model, which is a bit of cheating because obviously the aesthetic wasn't fully refined, but I think this model is actually really, really good for the time. I would love to own this model. Just his helmet feels a lot more like an archetypal sort of spaceman from a sci-fi movie, rather than the usual smoother aesthetic that we see with Eldar characters today. And the lack of a faceplate is definitely very interesting. It almost seems like there's some vestiges of what would become the Spirit Seers many, many years later. Overall, though, I really quite like this model. I think it's very solid, and of course this was for the Eldar and released in 1st edition as it was released in 1991. Fighting this model, of course, would be very difficult, but it is one that I'd like to have someday. Moving on next, we have another strange entrant, which is a bit more bizarre than our previous ones. It's the Aspiring Sorcerer for the classic Rubric Marines. This guy was released in 2002, and he makes this list for being an almost carbon copy of this Sorcerer. The only thing they really changed was the right arm and his helmet. Everything else is exactly the same. The more you look, the more similarities you see. This is a great model, so I don't really mind. I think it's just interesting to see one of the most obvious, just very, very subtle resculpts done in the era of metal models. Of course, this saved on sculpting costs to make this model not as costly to GW. I do think this model is really good, and I think it actually looks better than the model that it is effectively just a complete copy of. But I just think it's interesting, as I believe it is like the most apparent and obvious note of this ever happening in Warhammer 40k's history. Though again, I think this model is very solid, and I think it's a very well-loved model, obviously. It's one of the few models Thousand Sons had for the longest time. Moving on to number 7, we're staying in the realm of chaos, and we have the Possessed from 2006. These guys look rather bizarre, certainly. They don't really come across as threatening so much as silly, but the main thing that brings them onto this list, aside from their just very bizarre appearance, especially that guy on the top right, I wonder what he is on, personally, but these guys were just an extremely short-lived kit. Being released sometime in 2006, they were replaced only about a year or so later with the plastic Possessed that superseded them for many, many years. These models just kind of look bizarre and were very clearly not well liked that much if they were so quickly replaced. Honestly, they also just don't look very good for 2006, if I'm being entirely real. They don't really look like insane possessed people, they more look like bizarre cartoon characters than anything else. And I would say they are easily the weakest of the possessed kits that we've had. Out of the 3, they are in a distant third, that is to be sure, excluding some of the other things like Warp Talons, which are technically possessed, but you know what I mean. Moving on to number 6, we have our first entrant from the Dark Eldar, and these are Grotesques from 1998. Of course, these are for the Drukhari, which honestly I only say because I think Drukhari is really fun to say, but I thought these guys were just really interesting as they almost seem to be proto-Rax, if you will, where they aren't these big hulking monsters that Grotesques would be known to become in a few years' time, only I believe about 6 years after this, 4 to 6 years. They were just sort of weird-looking infantry, and these guys certainly are weird-looking and infantry, and they are on very small bases, and you know that these guys are very small because they're on a base and not spilling over the edges, a very common issue in the 90s as almost everything was on about a base size too small, of course down to the minimum size of 25mm, which these guys fit quite comfortably on. They also just look very bizarre, honestly. They don't fit all that well into the Dark Eldar aesthetic, in my opinion. Moving on to number 5, we're going into some more niche things with our Demon Prince on the list, actually. I'm sure many would assume the Nurgle one would have made the list, but it's actually Doomrider, a demon prince of the Emperor's Children, and of course devoted to Slaanesh. This bike-mounted character was released in 1999, and is, of course, a sort of singular being. He actually showed up relatively recently after Jagatai Khan cut his head off, not Jagatai, Kursaro Khan cut his head off, which kept talking even after he did so. He's known for being insane and very temperamental, even more so than your average demon prince, and his bike is equipped with melta-guns instead of the standard sort of bolt rifles you'd expect. Very strange model that I don't think looks particularly good, and it is interesting that despite the fact he is Emperor's Children, he looks a bit more like a Night Lord, if I'm being entirely real with you. But that is perhaps just a difference in color scheme than anything else. Moving on to number 4, our next entrant on this list is actually a Imperial Guard walker. This is the original Sentinel. Released in 1998, this walker is just very bizarre and very far removed. Really, the only similarity this shares with the Sentinels of today is that it has 2 legs. From its bizarre assault cannon with almost a Maxim gun-like muzzle on it, to the fact it's open-topped with our rather dumpy-looking pilot up there, and the fact that this thing is 90% legs and its huge headlights. It just looks very, very odd, and I'm not surprised that this was not a design that got updated, but instead was fully redesigned. It's definitely an odd one, and it's not one I wouldn't mind having in my collection, just because it just looks so strange. It doesn't really feel like it fits in the setting that well, even in the Wild West of the 90s when it comes to Warhammer. I just think that this walker is bizarre. That's really the best way to put it, it's just bizarre. Moving on, we have an entrant from everybody's favorite, the Space Marines. This is perhaps the most heretical model to ever be made. This is a Space Marine released in 1988 or thereabout, equipped with a shuriken catapult. Now, of course, a Space Marine wielding a Xenos weapon is a high heresy, if you will, these days, But that just kind of goes to show how things really have changed so much, even in ways people may not expect. But this was also the era where every army could use Land Raiders, including Eldar, so it really was just an equal opportunity sharing our knowledge kind of era back in Rogue Trader. This is a rather infamous model. You can find almost countless 3D prints of it, just because it's so bizarre and stands in the face of so much Warhammer lore. It's honestly baffling, but Warhammer lore has never been consistent, and it never really will be. And this guy is just kind of the grandfather of that, especially given the fact that he's wielding a weapon that shouldn't fit in his hands at all. But that's not really important. Space Marines weren't that big back in Rogue Trader is the thing, because they weren't even really genetically modified soldiers. At number 2, we have one of my most hated models of all time, the Obliterators. Now, when you look at these guys, you probably assume, oh, they probably came out around the same time as those Possessed, right? No. These resin models came out in 2012. Keep in mind, this was after Dark Vengeance, which brought in a new era of Chaos Space Marine designs, things like Hellbrutes, Chosen, Cultists, that all looked fantastic and were highly detailed. I can only imagine the Obliterators must have been on the shelf for a very long time before being shipped, because these models are hideous and look just about as bad as the original Obliterators, the original Obliterators, these are mutilators. I think I've got those two mixed up. And the original Obliterators released in 1998, and these models came out, 14 years later? I hate the mutilators, and I am glad they never got an update, though I actually kind of would like to see if they would get one. And at number 1, we have perhaps the most out-of-left-field Warhammer model ever, a Dark Eldar Exarch known as Kruella the Vile. Now, this is a very bizarre reference to 101 Dalmatians, which is just, of course, a classic Disney movie. I'm sure most of you know what that is. From her color scheme to her hair to her name, it's just kind of a very bizarre reference. This model came out in 1999 and has a little bit of lore behind it. She is an Archon, surprisingly enough. And it's just a very, very strange whole thing, from the color scheme, the hair, the name. I'm not exactly sure what demented a Games Workshop designer in the late 90s to make one of the Eldar's characters a 101 Dalmatians reference, but honestly, good on him. This, of course, has a lot of that 90s fantasy aesthetic with the entire outfit. I don't really need to say much about that, but it's just a bizarre one, and honestly, a model I'd like to own just for the sheer absurdity of it. Anyways, I've been Spoons Rattling. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know your favorite model down below, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.